Hey kids, this is Ivan. I told you this was going to be long. This is the third in the weapons installment series. I told you we had a lot to cover, so here it is. We're going to start now on 1.5e. Now remember we were talking about weapons proficiency slots with first edition. Well, here's where it gets a little bit weird and a little bit interesting. Because the book Unearthed Arcana introduced the idea of weapon specialization. So you could spend your weapons proficiency slots to become specialized in weapons. Only fighters and rangers were allowed to do this. Paladins were no longer subclass of fighters. They were now a subclass of cavaliers. Remember that really incredibly fun class from the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon? Yeah, it was great. But anyhow, weapon specialization in most weapons costs you an additional proficiency slot. You could do this right from first level. Say you're a fighter, you want to spend 2 slots on the longsword. Hooray, you're specialized in it. You get to spend your other 2 slots on proficiencies. Everything else is still a -4 to hit that you're not proficient in. Now, when used with a melee weapon, what it did was it gave you a +1 to your attack roll and a +2 to damage. It also increased the number of attacks per round that you got, and what it did was bump you up 1 level. So when you were at the point where you're supposed to be getting 1 attack per round, with your specialized weapon, you got 3 attacks every 2 rounds. When you were supposed to be getting 3 every 2 rounds, with that weapon, you got attacks every, 2 attacks a round. And when you were supposed to be getting 2 attacks a round, you got 5 attacks every 2 rounds. So it helped you out in that method as well. Also, you could opt to become double specialized. You have to spend a 3rd slot on that weapon, which you could do right from the get-go. And what that gave you was now you had a +3 to your attack roll and a +3 to your damage roll. And you could do that with any handheld weapon except for 2-handed sword and pole arms, because I guess they decided they didn't want people becoming that specialized in those giant weapons. I don't know why. For thrown and hurled weapons, things were a little bit different. They'd still give you a +1 to your attack roll and a +2 to your damage roll, but it increased your rate of fire. And because these things normally didn't have a rate of fire increase over time, but what it did was it tied it to 7th and 13th level, just like when your rate of attacks would go up with a handheld weapon. And that's what pretty much what it did for like the hurled stuff, the hand axes and what have you, thrown daggers. Bows were a different story altogether. First off, if you wanted to become specialized in a bow other than the crossbow, it was going to cost you 2 slots. So you have to spend 3 slots right from the get-go to become not only proficient but specialized in a bow. Crossbow would cost you just the extra slot. Now, bows were pretty bad in this concept, because first thing that it introduced was the idea of point-blank range. Now, we've been playing with point-blank range before, and it's just saying, okay, it's a +1 to hit or +1 to damage or whatever. But they formalized it. Point-blank range gave you +2 to hit, +2 to damage, plus double damage on top of that. So it was really, really lethal. Now, when you were firing off at short range, you got a +1 to hit and a +1 to your damage roll. And with a crossbow, when you were firing at medium range, you still got a +1 to hit, just no pluses to damage. It also increased your rate of fire as well. So around 7th and 13th level, the rate of fire of bows and crossbows actually went up, which was kind of interesting. They also introduced the idea that specialized users of bows, if they had an arrow or a bolt knocked before initiative, could actually fire that thing off before initiative even got rolled. They were just that prepared. They could shoot the arrow. So that was kind of nifty. Now, rangers actually got, kind of the short end of the stick. They had a list of weapons they had to become proficient in. They only started out with 3 slots, not 4. And there were 4 types they had to get proficient in. So they needed to be proficient in either the bow or the crossbow, some kind of sword, a spear or an axe, or a dagger and a knife. And those were the 4 things they had to, get before they could do anything else. If they wanted to specialize or be proficient in another kind of bow, they had to get all these 4 classes filled first. So they needed to use their first extra slot just to get the last item. And then in order to specialize, they couldn't even start to do that till 7th level, because that's when their next slot would show up, and they finally had to fulfill their proficiency requirements in terms of what they were supposed to use. Also, UA did one other thing, where they messed with the number of attacks with handheld weapons that fighter types got. They introduced the Barbarian class, who got extra attacks at 6th and 11th level. Fighters still got them at 7th and 13th. Rangers still got them at 8th and 15th. The Cavalier, the new Cavalier subclass or class, got him at 6th, 11th, and 16th. And at 16th level, he got 5 attacks every 2 rounds. And the Paladin, he got extra attacks at 7th, 13th, and 19th level, where he got 5 attacks every 2 rounds. Now on to 2nd edition, where things get even weirder. The Ranger was no longer allowed to specialize in weapons at all, but he no longer had a penalty to offhand attacks. They did some different stuff with the 2nd edition of Ranger altogether I don't even want to get into, but he was allowed to use 2 weapon fighting, and he didn't have that -4 penalty on his offhand. It was -2, -2. Intelligence could be used to buy extra weapons proficiencies. Nifty idea. Or you could use it to buy extra skills. Does that sound familiar to some of you newer gamers? A character could actually buy the ability to be ambidextrous with a weapons proficiency slot and then not have to take that offhand penalty when using two weapons. There was also a bunch of weapons fighting styles introduced that you could actually buy proficiency in with your proficiency slots, as well as being specialized in weapons. Magic users and clerics were actually shut out of two-weapon fighting because they just didn't start out proficient in those styles. Everybody started out proficient in a certain number of these styles, and there were the four styles were the single weapon style, the two-hander style, holding a weapon with two hands, the weapon and shield style, self-explanatory, and the two-weapon style. And all classes start out proficient in them, but you could become specialized in them by using your slots. And magic users were the only one that could not specialize in the fighting style. So even though they knew how to do the two-hander style and the single weapon style, they couldn't become specialized in it. Now, being proficient or specialized rather in the single weapon style was cool because it left your other hand free to do other things. You could do other nifty mechanics with it. When you spent one slot on becoming specialized in that style, you got one better to your armor class when using a weapon that you were proficient in. You didn't get it when you were using a weapon you weren't proficient in. If you spent two slots in being specialized in one-handed fighting style, then you actually got two better to your armor class. So it was that whole fencing idea I was talking about, where you're using that weapon as a shield and attacking with it at the same time. Everybody also started out proficient in the two-hander style. Just using that style in the proficient mode alone meant that it took two attacks to disarm you. You had to have two successful disarm attempts. If they disarmed you once, what it did is you lost initiative. You still held onto the weapon with the other hand. But if you were to get specialized in this thing, it reduced the speed factor of the weapon you were using by 3, which was kind of helpful because a lot of those weapons had very high speed factors, and so you could wield it a lot faster. You could also use a lot of one-handed weapons when you were specialized in the two-handed style. Use them two-handed and get +1 to your damage roll. The weapon and shield style were something that fighters and clerics started out specialized, or proficient in rather. And was specialized in this style, you could gain 2 attacks per round, one of them being with a shield. And there were all kinds of shield bash things and special shield weapons, a lot of them you'll see in modern games too. But when you did that, you did not get any bonus to your armor class when you did that. Now, if you were ambidextrous, you did not get you got the penalties were -2 and -2 instead of -2 and -4 because they treated it like two-weapon fighting. But if you spent a second slot on the style, then the penalties actually went down to 0, -2, or 0, 0 if you were ambidextrous. So it was pretty cool. Fighters and thieves started out proficient in the two-weapon style, the dreaded two-weapon style. Now, this just specializing in this style dropped the attack penalty from -2, -4 to 0, -2 in terms of those two weapons. If you're ambidextrous, then it's 0, 0. You can attack just at will with these weapons with no penalties whatsoever. Second, even best, you got to use 2 weapons of equal size, so you could sit around and swing around 2 swords and be that really cool guy with the 2 swords. If you attempted 2 different maneuvers, if you weren't just attacking with both swords, if you were trying to do something else with the other sword, they were both at -1, but if you were attempting to do the same thing with both swords, they were both at normal attack rate. So that was 2nd edition. Rule Cyclopedia. That should be its own installment all by its lonesome, because that has a very interesting take on this.